Donald Trump brings his bullying, populist presidential campaign to the global stage in UN debut. There were moments during U.S. President Donald Trump's first speech before the United Nations General Assembly when it felt like he was back on a campaign debate stage, once again railing against rivals like Little Marco, Lion Ted and Crooked Hillary. This time it was Rocketman Kim Jong-un and the, as yet, unnicknamed Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, that were seemingly just out of camera shot absorbing Mr. Trump's rhetorical jabs. This was Mr. Trump's bullying, populist presidential campaign taken to a global stage. The formula was all too familiar: we are facing dangers and decline, it's us versus them, and I'm on your side. Instead of his campaign boasts about his poll numbers and personal wealth, standing in front of the top diplomats and some leaders from 193 member nations, Mr. Trump boasted about America's economic and military might, both of which, he says, have improved since his election. Like so many speeches on the campaign trail, Mr. Trump called for nationalism over globalism, and broadened his familiar jingoism to include other nations. In World War II, Mr. Trump said, patriotic Poles fought for Poland, the French for France and the Brits for Britain. Conveniently overlooked, of course, were the Germans fighting for Germany, Italians for Italy and Japanese for Japan. Just as Mr. Trump thinks less government is good government at home, he now argues less American involvement in other countries' affairs is the best way forward. America, Mr. Trump says, will be guided by outcomes, not ideology, and a policy of principled realism. In that, he could have been describing himself. And to a point, it seems to suggest a live and let live approach while providing an aspirational example to others, more of a restatement of President Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill rather than George W. Bush's post-9/11 global policeman. Mr. Trump argues all nations should be guided by self-interest, and only act together when those interests overlap, such as in North Korea and Iran. But don't expect Trump's America to waste any more time and money trying to remake other nations in its own image. If there were any doubts about his appeal to populism, in his address, Mr. Trump used the word people 50 times, and sovereignty 21. Yet, revealingly, he said the word democracy only 3 times. Interestingly, given the gravest threat to America's sovereignty and democracy in a long time came with Russia's interference in last year's U.S. election, he mentioned America's great strategic rival just once, and that was to thank them for supporting stricter sanctions against North Korea. Just as Mr. Trump rewrote the rules of acceptable language during the campaign, it was kind of weird to hear the president describe another leader as depraved, while threatening to totally destroy North Korea. But then again, this is the same UN where Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev took off a shoe and banged it like a gavel, and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez said he could smell sulfur after President George W. Bush had left. Will Trump's bold gambles pay off? Running for the presidency, Mr. Trump often promised to repeal and replace Obamacare, but has yet to do so. And he overturned another Obama policy to allow illegal immigrants who arrived as children to avoid deportation, only to cut a tentative deal with Democrats to let them stay. During his 2016 campaign, Mr. Trump threatened to walk away from NATO, but hasn't, tear up NAFTA, yet didn't, and walk away from the Paris Climate Agreement, which he did, but now says maybe he won't if he can renegotiate on more favorable terms, which every nation is already able to do under the terms of the treaty. Mr. Trump is now threatening to tear up the multinational deal aimed at stopping Iran developing nuclear weapons. Mr. Trump must periodically recertify the Iran agreement for Congress. At the UN General Assembly he indicated he probably would not, describing it as one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the U.S. has ever entered into and an embarrassment. We'll find out in the weeks ahead what Mr. Trump will do in reality. Maybe after 2 years on the political stage and 8 months in the presidency, we are getting a bit more used to the ways of President Donald Trump. He talks big. He threatens dramatic action, sending Hillary Clinton to jail, destroying North Korea, tearing up treaties and agreements, scrapping alliances and overturning policies. But that is simply his bold opening gambit, the start of the negotiation that often ends on more favorable terms as a result. For Mr. Trump, it's all still about the art of the deal.